Thank you for joining us. My name is Yakov Feygin. I'm the director of the Future of Capitalism program at the Berggruen Institute in Los Angeles. The Berggruen Institute is an idea incubator, engaging with the great transformations of our time and brainstorming solutions for 21st century problems. I am proud to introduce Professor Saule Omarova, the Beth and Mark Goldberg Professor of Law at the Cornell University School of Law and a Senior Fellow in the Future of Capitalism program at Berggruen. Professor Omarova joins us to discuss her new report with the Institute, the National Investment Authority, a blueprint. Professor Omarova has spent almost 5 years laying out a vision for a new modernized version of a reconstruction finance corporation that can leverage the federal government's unique position in financial markets to aggressively invest in America's infrastructure and productive capacity. The NIA's goal is to rebuild finance so that it serves the real economy and creates jobs and broad prosperity. Professor Omarova's new report is the most extensive illustration of her vision yet, detailing how the NIA will be organized and managed responsibly to work for the American people. To view the report, which also includes a framing introduction as well as illustrative studies, please go to the Berggruen website or follow the link in the description. I would also like to remind our audience on YouTube they're all welcome to ask questions by emailing rsvp@berggruen.org. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Omarova and begin asking her questions to explain the nature and revolutionary function of the NIA. So, Professor Omarova, could you describe the NIA and how it differs from the contemporary budget process? What are its advantages relative to legislation such as the traditional budgetary process or to other acts such as what we know now as the American Rescue Plan or the CARES Act?
Well, thank you very much, Yakov, for your kind introduction. And it's a great question to begin our discussion today. You are absolutely correct. There are many legislative initiatives that currently target specific sectors in particular, like semiconductors or certain physical infrastructure, or focus on funding research and development and technological innovation. And these are all very encouraging developments toward very important goals. But they generally offer only partial solutions to the most immediate problems. And they somewhat lack a truly strategic dimension, which is necessary for a large-scale economic transformation. The first such dimension is the scope and scale of the investment program. We need a coordinated, synergistic solution to a complex of problems that are closely interrelated. So targeting one currently hot area of production or infrastructure, for example, simply isn't enough. We also need more effective and flexible tools and methods of rebuilding the economy on a more resilient, environmentally safe, and equitable basis, and not simply a one-time budget item for grants or loans to private companies. And that requires a strong institutional platform that has the resources, expertise, and tools to channel investment into multiple sectors, regions, communities, and types of infrastructure over the long run, responding flexibly to changing demands and conditions. So the NIA proposal seeks to create precisely this type of institution for conducting a coordinated program of national economic development as an ongoing project. You're absolutely correct. The NIA is designed as a reconstruction finance corporation for the 21st century, a hybrid entity that has the financial might of the United States behind it, but operates directly in financial markets, not only as a lender, but also as an investor, venture capitalist, and asset manager. And the NIA is designed not to be beholden to federal budget politics with all of its uncertainties, but also not be limited simply to subsidizing private firms that rationally prioritize private profits over long-term public interests. The NIA is a hybrid entity that would actively use financial market tools to produce long-term benefits like domestic job creation, reindustrialization, shift to clean technologies, and so on and so forth.
Brilliant, thank you. So you've written about the potential for an NIA for quite a few years now. What's new in this particular report that you wrote with us, and how would you want readers of the report to approach it as a document?
So that's also a great question. This particular report is the next step in this long process of trying to develop a big idea into an actual design. This is, if you will, a lawyer's take on this project. It's a walkthrough, a legislative proposal to establish the NIA. So this particular white paper sets up all of the key elements of the three-tier NIA system: its organization, its mandate, its primary sources of funding, the criteria and the process for project selection, and various accountability mechanisms. So it does it in sufficient detail, explaining the reasoning behind specific design features and describing potential options along with their pros and cons. In effect, this is meant to be an assistant tool for policymakers and legislators trying to really implement into legislation, into the statute, this idea. Of course, inevitably, many specific questions can only be answered once the entire structure is in place and certain strategic decisions or options are already chosen. But this particular approach, this white paper that we are unveiling today, is the most in-depth and comprehensive design document at this point.
So you've already described the NIA as a hybrid entity, one that sits between the government and the market and shapes it. How would the NIA then interact with other government entities, for example, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury? What could the NIA do that they can't do? And whether its relationship to the private sector, and how will that relationship differ from other federal agencies that can issue loans and loan guarantees, for example, the Department of Energy and its loan guarantee program?
Right. This is also a very important question. You are absolutely correct. The NIA is designed to be right up there with the Federal Reserve, our central bank, and the Treasury. It's supposed to be an equally high-profile federal institution with an explicit legal mandate complementing the work of both the Fed and the Treasury. So currently the Fed, of course, as we know, does monetary policy. And it sort of follows its mandate that's been interpreted in a particular way and sort of tries not to get too involved in basically allocating resources on the ground. The Treasury, on the other hand, can allocate and does allocate capital to certain fiscal priorities. It conducts fiscal policy. And the two types of policies, monetary policy and fiscal policy, often get blurred, especially during crisis. And of course, the blurring of monetary and fiscal policies creates a lot of political controversy, a lot of frictions, and inefficiencies. And that's because much of that blurry, scary space in between the monetary and the fiscal policies is what is really an industrial strategy, right? So industrial strategy specifically targets the composition of the nation's economy. Priorities for specific sectors, products, technologies, regions are established as part of this process of identifying the country's strategic needs and then coordinating and financing investment into addressing these needs, and to do so dynamically and flexibly because the world constantly changes. And neither the Fed nor the Treasury are currently able to do that effectively for somewhat different reasons. And that's exactly what needs to be done. And that's exactly what the NIA would be doing with a clear mandate and the right toolkit. It is designed not as a traditional federal agency in that sense, but as a hybrid, a public market actor. If you will, it will be the state's entrepreneurial muscle. And it will work directly with the industries, with private businesses and communities, much more directly and closely than, for example, the Treasury or any of the current federal agencies dispensing loans can work with them. And the NIA will effectively be the day-to-day partner, business partner for all of these private and public and cooperative actors, not just as a third-party lender and regulator, but literally getting in there, sharing the risks when it's necessary, coordinating and kind of helping things along when it's necessary, but also provide a forward-looking perspective vision where that's necessary. And there's a lot of good that can be done this way, in addition to what the Fed does, what the Treasury does, and what different departments in our federal government do currently.
I just want to quickly add, one of the things that attracted me to this report, and one of the reasons I'm so excited to work with you, is that, you know, it took a very long time for central banking as we know it to evolve and bring stability to the price of money and to create a reference rate across even the entire United States for a price of money. The difference between the value of a dollar in California and one in New York used to be massive. And I think what we've done, while we set up that piece of our economy quite well, the investment cycle is still extremely unstable, and we don't really have a tool yet to get a grasp of it, unlike what we've done with the monetary cycle. And I think it's very interesting to see this institution envision and to see how it will evolve to begin to stabilize that side of the economy. So I think the potential here is actually quite revolutionary, right? Excuse me. So just to kind of continue in our conversation here, we've seen many types of similar institutions around the world, or at least ones that are somewhat analogous. We've seen development banks which do specific development lending into either infrastructure or even industrial projects. We've seen sovereign wealth funds which usually take relatively passive, but sometimes even active positions in private businesses. What makes the NIA similar to those? And more importantly, what makes it different? How does it move beyond those two very familiar models?
Yes, Yakov, you are once again asking a very important and complicated question, right? Each country and each region, of course, has its own unique constraints, needs, and opportunities. And you're absolutely correct to point out that both Europe and Asia are well ahead of us, Americans, in realizing the potential of public coordination and investment in strategic industries. We know, there is European Investment Bank, for example, along with other multilateral and also national development banks that have been operating at least since the 50s, and in many situations, much longer than that. And we do have this example of sovereign wealth funds, particularly from countries where there is an inflow of income, for example, from natural resources. And the goal is to kind of preserve that capital for future generations. And all of these are public entities or sort of quasi-public entities that play an incredibly important role in sort of filling the gaps in the investment and creating new opportunities for infrastructural growth and industrial production in their own countries. So the NIA certainly builds on many of the elements that a lot of these existing development institutions, public institutions in other countries display. But it is also trying to take the game to the next level, if you will. It is designed to have a broader and more holistic mandate and to have more flexible tools. In other words, the NIA is not going to be limited simply to, for example, extending loans or maybe co-investing to de-risk other private investors in a particular infrastructure project that is otherwise almost commercially viable, right? And so that entrance of that particular development bank taking on the riskiest slice of that investment would effectively speed up the commercial profitability of that particular project. No doubt the NIA will do that, but the NIA is designed to do more than that. It's designed to kind of look forward, be more prospective, bolder in its approach, and actually spearhead a lot of the investment that perhaps would not necessarily be initiated purely from the private sector. And with respect to the sovereign wealth funds, as you mentioned, for the most part, sovereign wealth funds are passive market investors, and they typically invest in various traded financial instruments abroad with the goal of essentially capital appreciation. The NIA, however, will actively invest in a wide variety of projects and through various tools. And the goal of the NIA's investments is not simply capital appreciation, but actual economic and results and domestic growth. So that's how I would draw that distinction. And of course, the distinctions come through in the structure, organization, and all of these other features of the design.
And just to, again, editorialize a bit on that answer, which I think covers things quite well. Again, one of the reasons I'm so drawn to this vision is, the United States' largest export are its capital assets. It is its financial liabilities. The world requires them. And it would be, the NIA does let us control what that goes into, what those inflows go into, a little bit better than the current system. And I do think that that does create a rather interesting analogy, right, to sovereign wealth funds in oil exporters or in large exporters, that we have to have something similar, but in a different guise. I want to get back to our questioning, just to dig in on what the NIA looks like a bit. You've divided the NIA into the National Capital Management Corporation and then into the National Investment Bank. Could you describe why you made that design choice and what the differences between those two institutions would be, and maybe how they might interact also?
Well, first of all, Yakov, your sort of clarifying comment to the previous answer is absolutely spot on, right? In the United States, we are very fortunate to have the world's deepest, most liquid, most coveted financial markets, and the depth of our capital markets is still unparalleled, and we do need to seize on that. So the structural division that this particular proposal currently envisions between two operating subsidiaries of the NIA, one being the National Infrastructure Bank, NIB, and the other being National Capital Management Corporation, NICIMAC or NCMC, is of course not something that is absolutely preordained and absolutely must happen, but it is a choice that makes it easier to separate two types of strategies or strategic approaches to investment. So the NIB, the National Infrastructure Bank, is a credit mobilization arm of the NIA. It sort of focuses on more traditional tools, amplifying the flow of credit through market making, guarantees, loans, and so on and so forth. In effect, it does what, for example, housing GSEs, government-sponsored entities like Fannie Mae, do within their field. So you can think of the NIB as a broad-purpose industrial/infrastructure enabling Fannie Mae or infrastructure bank model. And it's important to have that portfolio of projects, and it's important to kind of focus at least one separate subsidiary on running that portfolio, because it sort of demands a certain kind of expertise and certain kind of market muscle to be developed, and so on and so forth. But the other arm of the NIA, as it is envisioned today, NICIMAC or NCMC, is designed to be an equity investor and an active asset manager, a kind of a public venture capital fund. And the goal of that particular subsidiary of that government corporation would be to fund more transformative, perhaps longer term, more innovative projects that cannot be financed solely through credit, because credit tools, lending, has its limits, right? When there is a potentially higher risk, for example, maybe because of the longer time horizons, or maybe the need for more systemic shifts in order for that particular new technology or new project to reach greater profitability. In those types of situations, creditors rationally may worry about sort of extending loans. So we would need a little bit more sort of risk absorbing type of an investment, which is equity. And that's what the NICIMAC side of the NIA is designed to do. So we would separate the two entities so that each one of them can develop its own sort of set of strategies, but also personality as a financial market actor. And we definitely need both of those functions, and we need both of those entities.
Thank you. That's a great answer to the question. I actually want to dig in a little bit more onto the NCMC, or I like the way you call it, actually, Nicky Mac. I'm going to start using that more. It sounds nicer to say. That's slightly less familiar, I think, to a lot of the audience in the traditional kind of government letter model. Can you talk a little bit more about how it's a relatively new development and how you've described it as a public option for private equity? How would it work in that way, and how would you prevent it from having the downsides of private equity? How would we think about accredited investors, so people that can participate in Nicky Mac pools alongside Nicky Mac, and make sure that those are not don't have the same problems as we've seen with private equity investments, for example, job destruction, environmental problems, can name all kinds of things, all kinds of value destructing activities.
Right. You are absolutely right. The Nicky Mac side of the proposal, unlike the NIB side of the proposal, tends to generate more questions simply because, like you said, we are not quite so conditioned to think of public investment through the lens of sort of venture capital type of asset management. We are much more familiar with grants and loans, for example, or guarantees of some sort. And like I said, the Nicky Mac is envisioned as a specialized equity investment arm of the NIA, which supplements the traditional familiar kind of lender type tools, and will focus on the types of projects that involve higher potential risks, more transformative, more innovative projects, but also the kinds of projects that are likely to have the greatest systemic impact. So Nicky Mac is in fact modeled after a very well-known and proven model of an asset manager, except that model, as we know it today, exists only in the private world, in the world of private fund managers, right? So the Nicky Mac model is essentially a publicly owned asset manager. Think about it as, I don't know, publicly owned BlackRock or publicly owned Blackstone, whatever you call it, right? And it will operate just like that. Just like BlackRock or Blackstone or any other private asset manager would operate in the private market. It will set up a series of funds. And for each fund, it would determine the portfolio strategy for this particular fund. It could be, for example, the strategy aiming to finance some kind of a new product or new technology, or it could have a sectoral strategy like energy or housing or whatever it is. Or it could have a more holistic, but perhaps regionally, geographically, or community-focused type of a strategy. Once they develop that kind of strategy, they would invite institutional investors like pension funds, for example, as to participate, to invest in those funds as limited partners. And of course, just like any limited partner in any private equity fund or venture capital fund, these investors these limited partners will be passive. In other words, they will not actually manage the investments of that Nicky Mac fund. And their capital would be locked up in that fund for 7 to 10 years. Again, everything is directly in parallel to how the asset management model works currently. So as the general partner, as the asset manager for that fund, Nicky Mac will manage the fund's investments in a way that maximizes the long-term benefits to the economy. And then upon the expiration of the term of that fund, 10 years, 7 years, or whatever, Nicky Mac, again, as the fund manager, will determine the exit from these investments. So some projects, for example, may be ripe for sale to some private investors at that point, right? Some projects may be transferred to public utilities or public authorities of some sort, or they may be transferred to private utilities subject to certain regulation. And some projects, perhaps they're not yet sort of quite ready to be transferred out of the NIS portfolio. They still have time. They need time to kind of be completed. Those projects may be rolled over into the portfolio of the next fund that Nicky Mac will set up with a similar strategy. So the fund investors' returns, the pension funds who participate in these funds, their returns, however, unlike the returns in the private fund world, will not need to be tied strictly to the resale value of the fund's assets. They will be tied to the public benefits that the fund's assets are either generating or are projected to generate in the long run. So in essence, the limited partners in NICIMAC funds are getting at the close of the individual fund a reasonable reward for their role in financing innovative, large-scale, clean infrastructure and industrial projects, even where these projects or some of these projects may not yet be at the point of generating commercial profits. So being able to do that involves financial engineering, adapting familiar techniques in private finance to this particular situation. And I know it may sound a little wonky, a little too unrealistic or whatnot, but it's actually not that far off. It's not that unrealistic. The key to this model is large diversified portfolio of funds and therefore assets that NICIMAC would be running, and liquidity backup support from the federal government, from the Fed, and even in certain extreme circumstances, perhaps from the Treasury, right? So in effect, what NICIMAC will be doing with these funds is using the kinds of financial engineering we are seeing in the world of derivatives, in the world of structured finance, complex finance currently, but flipping it on its head and using the metrics and using the standards for judging the reasonableness of reward and for even measuring the benefit beyond simply commercial cash flows, right? And kind of tying them to measurable, quantifiable, but much more dispersed, much longer term macroeconomic benefits. And that's the novelty of that technique. But the technique itself is not necessarily novel.
Thank you very much for that very, very enlightening answer. You in the report have developed a very detailed and robust oversight structure for the NIA. Could you talk a little bit about what makes it overseen like a normal federal entity, and then what new elements you suggest for its oversight that you don't typically see in a federal entity that might be required for this kind of agency? So for example, in the report, you describe the Public Interest Council and regional offices as particular new kinds of oversight and information gathering institutions within the NIA. How's that a bit different from how the federal government usually does things?
Right. So, well, first of all, let me admit upfront, right? One of the biggest concerns with setting up a potentially powerful new federal agency of the NIA type is the fear that that agency might actually be sidetracked, right? Might get, dare I say, corrupted by various, private industry interests, but also misused by incumbent politicians. So it is absolutely critical to the success of the NIA, particularly in the long term, to ensure public accountability and transparency of its operations. Now, having said that, right, we need to be realistic. It's impossible ahead of time to guarantee that here's one kind of silver bullet, right, for making this particular federal institution absolutely impervious to any kind of mistakes or any kind of, influences from the outside or whatnot. But what we can do, and what I've tried to do in this particular white paper, was to create a number of different checks and balances sprinkled throughout the structure and process for operation of this entity, so that there are many points at which the decisions by the NIA at different levels are transparent, they can be audited, they can be discussed, and they sort of actually are required to be made only after the NIA has gone through the process of deliberating on the pros and cons of a particular project, of a particular investment, or a particular action, with the eye toward the likelihood of long-term public macroeconomic benefits actually being realized. So just starting very briefly with the structure, right? The structure of the NIA to some extent mimics the structure of the Federal Reserve System. It is envisioned not as a standalone infrastructure bank or a standalone, fund, but as a three-tier system. At the top of that system is an independent federal agency, the NIA board, that is similar to the Federal Reserve Board, would consist of several members appointed by the President of the United States with Senate confirmation. And the NIA board, as an independent federal agency, would really be the primary site of democratic control and accountability. One of the goals of the NIA board would be to oversee the actual market operations conducted by its operating subsidiaries, what we discussed a little bit earlier, the NIB, NICIMAC, and perhaps other operating subsidiaries that the NIA board or Congress might want to establish later on. So the NIA board will create a long-term national investment strategy, trying basically setting priorities for our sort of strategic industrial growth, for our shift to a clean, transformative new technology, and so on and so forth, and then oversee the implementation and financing and execution of this strategy by individual operating arms. So these operating subsidiaries are the second tier in that system, and they would be subject both to their own internal kind of governance mechanisms, but also, very importantly, to this oversight by the NIA board. And regional offices are meant as the third tier, the kind of the bottom tier of the system. These are essentially envisioned as local headquarters of the NIA. So here there is a big difference between the regional offices of the NIA and, for example, regional Federal Reserve banks. Unlike the regional Federal Reserve banks, the regional offices of the NIA are not meant to be standalone corporations or anything like that. They're simply local headquarters of the NIA. And we can have many more of them than the current number of Federal Reserve banks, right? It would sort of depend on how closely we would want the NIA to work with the local public authorities at the state, municipal level, tribal level, and so on and so forth, with communities and with businesses, local businesses. And so these regional offices will be those hubs connecting the central NIA that, the NIA board sitting in Washington, D.C., for example, with those local communities, local businesses, local entrepreneurs, local public authorities, in this sort of mutual feedback kind of loop, talking about what needs to be done, what kind of projects need capital, under what terms, and how the needs change, right? And then also regional offices, very importantly, would provide an institutional focal point for the feedback from the local communities and businesses and public authorities back to the top of the NIA with respect to the outcomes that people see on the ground. And so the efficacy of these regional offices is a very important element in ensuring the overall legitimacy and acceptance and trust into the NIA and its ability to really deliver results for all Americans and make all of the cities, all of the villages, all of the regions, and all of the communities in this country prosper equally. So on top of these features, right, the structure, the audits, the reports, the various requirements for example, project selection and whatnot, there is a proposal to create a public interest council. This is what you've mentioned specifically. So the public interest council is not technically part of the investing structure. It's not going to make any decisions with respect to which projects need to be financed on what terms, right? It is kind of a hybrid between an inspector general office, for example, and the permanent congressional oversight commission. It's a separate council whose goal is to be an independent watchdog, to be basically, the eyes and ears of the public that are looking over the NIA's shoulder, right? And making sure that then the NIA's decisions are not swaying or swerving in the wrong direction under the influence perhaps of the incumbent politicians or maybe powerful local business interests or whatever. And instead, that the NIA really is fulfilling its statutory mandate to basically implement, finance the national investment strategy that would, make the economy stronger. So the Public Interest Council would be will comprise independent experts from academia, from public interest and advocacy groups, from local communities, and so on and so forth. And the main duties of that Public Interest Council would be to, basically to collect information from the NIA, to engage in discussions with the NIA, to advise the NIA perhaps how to correct its course if the Public Interest Council really feels and receives feedback from the public that in some areas, for example, the NIA's policies are not delivering the maximum benefit to the public and so on and so forth, and then to evaluate the performance of the NIA in front of Congress. And sort of in that sense, the Public Interest Council is sort of the third party at the table, right, that would directly represent all of us.
Thank you for that very in-depth answer to a very complicated question. So we've talked a lot about the NIA, what it is and its capabilities. What are some of its limitations? What social and economic function can it not do that can only be done by the traditional budgeting process and through Congress's authorities?
Right. This is an excellent question. And to some extent, it is a very difficult question to answer up front and in the abstract, right? This is one of those issues where the precise contours and limits of the NIA's portfolio, particularly vis-a-vis other federal agencies, would need to be kind of determined, right? Once the NIA is being established and starts engaging in its business operations. But as a general matter, what is important to understand is that the NIA is not meant to supplant or replace fiscal policy channels. In other words, there may be some temptation to basically push everything that relates to the American economy and economic policy on the NIA, right? Just you do it. And that shouldn't be the case. Really, the Treasury and federal agencies, the Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, what have you, will still have to conduct the activities, the financing activities that they conduct currently, except they will be able to focus more directly on financing the kinds of projects and the kinds of activities that are properly suited to their traditional tools, which are grants, loans, and guarantees, right? And so to the extent that, for example, certain projects can be initiated on the ground by, let's say, certain private firms, private entrepreneurs, who would just need, affordable credit from the federal government because these types of projects that they have in mind will generate precisely the type of benefits that a particular federal agency's mandate and jurisdictional scope really encompasses, that a federal agency should go ahead and evaluate that kind of a proposal or request or application for a loan or a grant or guarantee on its own terms. And if that request actually fits within its statutory mandate, it should go ahead and do it. So that would allow the NIA to focus on the projects that are broader than, for example, the jurisdictional boundaries of a particular agency, broader than geographic boundaries. Maybe it's multi-state, truly regional product for some kind of a clean transportation system or clean communication system. it might be difficult to finance and organize that kind of financing for a project of this type through the existing budgetary process and through the existing fiscal channels. And that's where the NIA will come in. So basically, the NIA will fill the gaps where the budgetary process doesn't quite do the job, and where there is a greater need for coordination, flexible long-term funding, perhaps with an equity element to it, or more active participation by the public actor on the ground. So in that sense, I see that there are clear limits to what the NIA could or should be doing. But we should think about the NIA as part of the ecosystem of public and public-private finance that would basically allow the entire ecosystem to operate much more efficiently than it does today.
Thank you. I want to close my set of questions. We have a few very good ones from the audience with some questions about your work beyond the NIA. For example, you've written a bit on what you call the People's Ledger, and I know that's an ongoing project for you. And I think some of your colleagues at Cornell. Could you say a bit more about that project and how or whether it can relate to the NIA, and if the two are somehow integrated or come out of the same field of vision, so to say?
Right. So thank you for mentioning the People's Ledger. As you know, Yakov, and I am, a financial regulation expert, right? I used to be a banking lawyer, financial institutions lawyer. So my interest in industrial strategy and new institutions of public investment really comes from a place where the greatest concern is financial systemic stability, making sure that our financial system is resilient to shocks, that it functions well, and most importantly, that it channels capital into productive enterprise. And it's that last element that sort of is still missing to a great extent in our financial markets today. It's that last element that brought me to thinking about creating these new structures and new institutions of public investment that would enable a greater, more efficient flow of financial capital, of which we have plenty. As we said earlier, we have the world's deepest and most liquid financial markets, right? So to amplify the flow of that existing capital from, wherever it flows now, mostly kind of being trapped within the financial markets themselves, basically investing in other tradable financial assets in the secondary or maybe even tertiary markets, from that into the real economy and actually funding productive enterprise. So the NIA, to me, is not just a development bank of some sort or an asset manager, an industrial strategy type of investor, but it is first and foremost an important new actor in the financial markets. It's a financial actor. It's an issuer of attractive, safe assets, the NIA bonds and the NICIMAC fund interests, for example, which are backed by hard assets, public infrastructure assets, industrial assets. The NIA, if it is established as it is envisioned today, would serve as a new channel for investment capital to flow into the real economy, into clean, more sustainable, more equitable economic growth. So that would actually be a perfect asset, financial asset for the Fed, for the Federal Reserve, our central bank, to invest in, because the Fed's mandate is actually to maintain the long-run supply growth of credit and money commensurate with the economy's long-run potential to increase production. That is actually literally taken from the Federal Reserve Act, right? That's the ultimate mandate of the Fed. So the NIA, by issuing the bonds, for example, would actually offer the Fed a new asset class in which the Fed can invest. And that asset class would be designed specifically to increase the productive capacity of the American economy. And this is especially important. In other words, this kind of notion of thinking about the NIA bonds and other financial instruments that the NIA will issue in the markets as this sort of new potential opportunity for the Fed to actually channel credit into the economy, it's a particularly important issue to take on right now, because right now we are expecting, a decision, an ultimate decision as to whether or not the Federal Reserve is going to go forward with digitizing the US dollar, issuing the digital dollar or, central bank digital currency, CBDC in the United States, right? So currently, my sense is that the Federal Reserve is hesitant to consider certain design options for the digital dollar, for the CBDC that it is currently debating internally, right? And among other things, for example, the Fed is clearly unwilling to offer ordinary households and businesses direct assets to CBDC through the so-called Fed accounts, for example. That this is the idea that has been around and particularly in the last few years has been debated. And the big part of the reasoning as to why the Fed considers that idea unworkable for practical reasons is that it would actually blow up the size of the Fed's balance sheet, and there are not enough assets for the Fed to invest in to kind of balance out the growth in its liabilities. So, the NIA bonds offer one potential solution to that problem. Instead of investing in mortgage-backed securities or corporate bonds, for example, the Fed could actually channel a big chunk of its resources into the real production via the NIA. It's a new channel for the Fed to actually do what it is mandated to do by law, but what it cannot do right now effectively because there is no outlet for it. So the People's Ledger, it's an article I wrote. It's a metaphor. It's a metaphorical expression. It's a metaphor for making the Fed's balance sheet a platform for a more democratic and effective allocation of public credit and money to publicly beneficial uses. And I see the NIA as a very important part of that plan.
Thank you, Professor Omarova. We do not have a lot of time, unfortunately, for audience questions, but I might want to combine two together and paraphrase them a bit. There was one question about the NIA and whether it can interact with state institutions or whether we can set up similar ones on the state level. And another question that I know you've spoken to before, at least when we've spoken to about, is what the NIA means for American leadership in the world. If you could just address that before we have to, unfortunately, sign off.
Excellent question. So to the first question, absolutely, yes, the NIA will be specifically set up and it will be part of its mandate to cooperate closely with various state institutions and other sort of local level institutions of public finance, of perhaps infrastructure finance and management. This is the NIA is supposed to be, effectively the sort of the source of additional capital support and additional coordination and other forms of assistance that these local level institutions need currently and perhaps are not able to get. So that's very important. And the federal government, of course, has sovereignty over the money creation, right? And that gives the federal government much greater leeway in terms of financing the projects that we need to finance and sort of supplement and amplify state and local level investment. And the global aspect of it, again, look, we are behind a lot of countries in Asia and in Europe. So this is, if we actually do overcome our fear of the unknown, our sort of hesitance to really go big and think big, and start thinking about the NIA type federal institution of public investment, we would actually increase our resilience of our economy, our supply chains will be stronger, but also we would just have a stronger, much more flexible tool to do what needs to be done in the future. Right now, we don't know what kind of specific challenges we will face in the future, but our ability to compete in global markets will be significantly augmented if we have that kind of an institution actually constantly making sure that our economy is developing in the right direction.
Thank you so much for your time, effort, and leadership on this, Professor Omarova. I am so happy and proud to have done this event with you and to have helped write this report and get it to publication. If you are interested in reading more, and you should be, there is a link to the report in the YouTube description, or just go onto the Berggruen website. Again, thank you, Dr. Omarova, and a big thanks to the Berggruen team that helped us set this up, particularly to Marianne Andres and Leila Lorenzo. And I am very happy to have had you at this event. Thank you. Goodbye.
So if I may just also thank you, Yakov, and I want to thank the whole Berggruen team and all the wonderful people who wrote those case studies that are part of that report, and the support team. Without you guys, none of this would have been possible at the level as it is now. So thank you all.
Thank you so much.